In the long history of the British monarchy, no story has captured the world's imagination quite like that of King Edward VIII, a man born to rule but remembered as the king who gave up his crown for love. On the 23rd of June, 1894, inside White Lodge at Richmond Park, London, a boy was born. His name was Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, but to his family, he was simply David. This child would one day change the course of the British monarchy forever. As the eldest son of the future King George V and Queen Mary, Edward was destined for the throne. He grew up under strict discipline, schooled in duty, and later trained at Osborne and Dartmouth naval colleges. During the First World War, though forbidden to fight on the front lines, Edward earned respect for his frequent visits to soldiers at the front. When his father became king in 1910, Edward was invested as the Prince of Wales in a dazzling ceremony at Caernarfon Castle the following year. Young, handsome, and charismatic, he quickly became the most popular royal of his age. Newspapers adored him, society followed his every move. Yet, beneath the glamour, Edward was restless and drawn to a life of parties, nightclubs, and scandalous affairs with married women. And then, everything changed. In the early 1930s, Edward met a woman who would redefine his destiny, Wallis Warfield Simpson. Born in Pennsylvania in 1896, Wallis had lived a turbulent life. She had already divorced her first husband, a US Navy officer, and was married again to Ernest Simpson, a wealthy shipping executive. Wallis was witty, fashionable, and utterly captivating. By 1934, she had become the center of Edward's world. On the 20th of January, 1936, King George V died, and Edward became King Edward VIII. But with the crown came controversy. Almost immediately, Edward made it clear he intended to marry Wallis, once her divorce from Ernest was finalised. This set off a storm. The British government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, objected fiercely. The reasons were clear. Wallis was twice divorced, both ex-husbands still alive, and the king, as head of the Church of England, was expected to uphold values where divorce was forbidden. Beyond that, the governments of the Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, were equally opposed. Edward faced a choice: abandon Wallis, marry her against his government's wishes, splitting the empire, or give up the throne. And Edward chose love. On the 10th of December 1936, he signed the instrument of abdication. The very next day, his younger brother Albert, reluctant and nervous, was proclaimed King George VI. Then, in a voice heard across the world, Edward spoke to his people. On the 11th of December 1936, in a historic radio broadcast, he declared, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love." With those words, a king walked away from his crown. Edward was given the title Duke of Windsor. In 1937, once Wallis's divorce was complete, he married her in a small ceremony in France. Not a single member of the royal family attended. And though she was now the Duchess of Windsor, Wallis was denied the style of Her Royal Highness. That bitterness lingered for the rest of their lives. The couple spent much of their marriage in exile, between France, America, and, for a time, the Bahamas, where Edward briefly served as governor during the Second World War. But scandal followed them. Their meeting with Adolf Hitler in 1937 fueled suspicions of Nazi sympathies, casting a shadow over their reputation. In the years that followed, the Windsors became glittering fixtures of high society, attending lavish parties and mingling with the world's rich and powerful. But behind the glamour lay isolation. They were outsiders to the royal family, cut off from the life Edward had once known. By the 1960s, Edward's health faltered. His lifelong smoking habit had caught up with him. In the spring of 1972, he grew gravely ill with throat cancer. On the 28th of May that year, the Duke of Windsor died in Paris at the age of 77. His body was returned to Britain and buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Wallis, frail and increasingly reclusive, lived another 14 years. She passed away in 1986, finally laid to rest beside the man who gave up an empire for her. Edward VIII's story remains one of the most dramatic in royal history. His choice altered the monarchy forever, paving the way for George VI and eventually for Queen Elizabeth II. And so he is remembered not as the king who ruled, but as the king who loved, the man who gave up the throne for the woman who captured his heart